SAT Day. April of my junior year was an emotionally tumultuous time despite my positive mycospawn experience in River's basement. I've since learned that psilocytes can reveal truths of growth that take both time and growing pains to process. I was as musically successful that month as I wished to be. I wrote the lyrics and did the majority of the recording for my Golden Genesis album, but had decided to chop it down to a 4-song EP called Golden instead, with the tracks Cotton Serpent, Diamond Waves, Ghost Car Submarine, and Eternal Tree Reflection. Sure, I was happy with the progress, since those 4 tracks encompassed the meat and potatoes of my first mycospawn experience. But my notebook entries indicate that I also struggled with feelings of self-doubt and isolation. One section of an entry reads, "What exactly can be identified as the right track? If many who have succeeded had at times in their lives failed, then who is to say that the poorest among us couldn't one day be billionaires? What does it take? Which moves win the game? The game is constantly changing, so one's life approach must also constantly change." My guess is that, though I felt proud about my musical creativity, I wasn't so sure if it was the right track, or if I'd be able to face the scrutiny of the ever-changing game. I've since tried to have faith that whichever track one is on is inherently the right track, because the universe willed the track as such. I also now know that there is far more than just one game in the music industry, but somehow I became aware that I would need to keep setting the bar higher and higher for myself, and that I was far from resting on my laurels. Another journal entry reads, "The gears keep switching, and I wish my shift would just help me stay in one gear. It is tiresome to keep changing speeds, and sometimes I just want to relax and stay constant. I wish I didn't need the oil to smoothen my chain, but it's become apparent that this is the only way. It's obvious that no matter how inflated the tires are, they are useless without the gears. Oil is expensive, and handling it is a pain. It smells nice, but too much will make you sloppy, and then the pain won't go away." In this extended metaphor, my gears are my moods, and oil is the green power. I struggled with the fact that I wasn't able to maintain a consistently positive mood, and that the only way to do so seemed to be with the help of the green power. I didn't really mind this obligation, aside from the fact that green power was expensive and hard to hide from the several authority figures who did not approve. Additionally, I had started to feel impaired by my overconsumption of the green power. This wasn't completely new to junior year, but something I had been struggling with since the year prior. I wanted a reliable, measurable amount of green power consumption that would cater to productivity and mood stability. But during a time in which my only access to the green power was via the local black market of older kids, any notion of consistency with the product was out the window. As the constantly shifting gear analogy goes, though, it seems that this melancholic demeanour soon gave way to a confidence in the early days of May. The 2nd of May reads, "Stay childish and live in simpler ways. There is no better way to spend these hard days. Be serious only when you need to be serious. Relax when there is nothing to worry about. Be what you want to be. See who you want to see. And speak what you want to speak. Everyone has something to teach. See past preconception and encourage inception. Listen and analyze. Learn to be wise. Everyone has a reason for what they say. A peace of mind to offer, even your own father. Learn from experience, but trust innocent nature as well. Show what you know to those who you know will listen. Try to get others to listen. The only way to gain momentum is to try and gain speed. The only way to reach the top is to take steps forward." I'm almost certain that River and I tapped into the DSL connection in his basement on April 31st with Thomas as a green power-only sitter, but my memory of that time is far from vivid. All I can remember is the three of us, hacky-sacked, laughed, listened to music, and made music with harmonicas and tambourines. Regardless of the simplicity of our time spent hanging out in the basement, I feel that the prior chunk of my journal, from a few days after the experience, indicates that the DSL connection had renewed my outlook on life significantly and had brought me back to the wisdom I had arrived at just a month prior. Most of my DSL connections tended to run smoothly and euphorically without much of an edge, especially in those earlier days when I had little reason to feel resistance. So, with DSL in my possession, about a week later I planned another connection. The day started with me going to school to take the SAT. I didn't stress it much, considering how anxious I was to get out and take some DSL. I knew it would be tricky to navigate the connection throughout the day, because it was the weekend and my parents would be floating about the house. Since I had recently been around them while under DSL's connection before, however, I knew I would have at least an hour after ingestion to get my bearings before I would feel the need to skedaddle. So after my SAT around 11 a.m, I took the DSL chip and waited for River to arrive to pick me up. By the time he got to my place, I had started to feel a bit of a jitter. We took off toward Thomas's house with music blasting and the sunroof open. It was a beautiful spring day, and I already felt that the vibe was going to be positive as I tripped into the great unknown. Thomas's house was off in the woods, peacefully secluded from any intruders, and surely we'd be able to consume some green power and kick the ball around in his yard. When we got to Thomas's, we were surprised to find that he already had two people over, Jermian and Reem. Jermian was a fellow soccer friend, one of the best players that I grew up with, and he was always fun to play competitive games with. Reem was the classic class clown who would do anything for attention, as he had demonstrated by the following real events. In pre-K, Reem peed on the boys' bathroom floor while Leaf jumped over the stream. In 8th grade, he got detention for telling our math teacher to close her legs in response to the fish smell on our Hip City field trip, and during this day at Thomas's, he credit carded me in the arse while I was connected to DSL. I don't know what warranted his urge, but while we shot the shit in Thomas's room, I ended up staring out the window, and the next thing I knew, I felt a stiff hand swiped upward over my arse crack, which was luckily protected by my layer of jeans. I jumped and turned around as I exclaimed, "What the?" which in turn triggered a laughing fit from Reem and subsequent scolding from Thomas and Jermian. River had left to pick up Drew, James's younger brother from my first mycospawn experience, and had re-entered just after the credit carding incident. A strange phenomenon of the great unknown occurred upon his arrival. When I looked at River and thought of a thing to say to him, he immediately replied, "I know," as if it had been telepathically relayed. A similar thing happened a few other times that day, though those are harder to remember. I asked him what he was replying to since I hadn't vocalized enough to tell. Even though he wasn't under the influence of the DSL, River claimed that my thoughts just came to him without a second thought, and he merely responded to me as if we were talking. This phenomenon freaked me out a little, but ultimately it was a fun, mind-boggling experience. Apparently River could hear my thoughts while I was connected to the DSL connection. It wasn't anything that was under either of our controls, but these moments of telepathy frequented throughout the rest of the day, and I grew used to it. I even came to expect it as a new fact of reality. But there was River with Drew in the doorway, and I wouldn't be surprised if the reader has forgotten about Drew by this point. Drew and I ended up spending a lot of after-school afternoons together my sophomore and junior years, what with James off in college. We often consumed green power in the woods and simply chatted away, often in the arenas of socio-political and philosophical conversation. Drew had much of the same energy that James possessed, but he had a different moderation over his temperament. He enjoyed waxing on about rappers, law enforcement, and the fundamental nature of things during our past hangs. But this time in Thomas's room, he was extra loaded with conspiracy and UFO theories. Thomas, a practical realist with a condescending attitude toward the quixotic, wasn't having it as this sort of talk continued throughout the day. Dude, whoa, look, UFO, aliens, wow, we're certainly not alone, he said as he mocked Drew and pointed at the sky. Drew ignored Thomas easily without being bothered, and my encouragement for more UFO talk was all he needed. It seemed that DSL was made for the subject, and I was eating it up. I found it hard to not be dazed in bewilderment before the endless possibilities of alien existence. Into the late afternoon, we hung out in the sprawling athletic fields of the private school. We played soccer and goofed about, like one would want to find any group of young fellas doing. I felt like I was in the midst of a monumental social experience. I had gathered some of my most cherished friends, and there we were, engaging in friendly athleticism. Not to mention, I maintained a steady connection to DSL all the while. The day felt limitless despite the encroaching sunset, and I continued to see trails of all moving objects. Drew and I walked side by side while he passionately waxed philosophical. Anything could be going on in space, and in the stars. We don't know. How could we really know, with a capital K? The media is the media, and scientific news is delivered only in scientific journals and media, so all we can do is sit back and take their word for it. Imagine, Steverino. Why, there's no reason a door couldn't just appear right in front of us. A door to who knows where. Aliens could be amongst us in plain sight all the time, and we could never know because of something as simple as a perfectly evasive cloaking technology. How could we ever know? Drew spoke with charisma. It was all so true. Luckily it wasn't too true, with a capital T, so that I didn't experience a paranoid breakdown. Thank the heavens I wasn't convinced that aliens and/or the government were spying on me right there and then. But the bulk of his point was true. The possibilities were basically endless, and just because something hadn't happened yet, or hadn't been discovered, didn't mean that it never could be. I was almost too amused, practically ready for a paranormal event to take place. Nothing came, but at least the DSL sustained my sense of pure wonder and potentiality. The group made a decision to temporarily part ways. Drew and I would meet back at River's basement after we stopped at my place to pick up sleepover essentials. When Drew and I got to my place, I was reminded of how easy it could be to communicate with my parents while connected to the DSL. Instead of feeling annoyed by my mother's warnings and various paranoid ideas, I smiled and empathized with the fact that she had no idea what was going to happen to me once I left the house, and thus only said these things in order to be a quality protective mother. Okay, Mum. Okay. I know. I will. I delivered, almost as a cliched response. Drew couldn't help but crack up at the scene, and we headed off to River's house. On the ride over, Drew repeatedly became distracted by what he was seeing in the sky, even though he was driving and was supposed to keep his eyes on the road. I grew worried that this could be the way that I die, with Drew distracted by his alleged UFOs as he swerved into the left lane and got us totaled. But Drew kept it together as he slowed down here and there and pointed out stars that appeared to move in bizarre ways. At this point, I had started to fall into Thomas's camp of UFO annoyance and wished that Drew would let up so that we could get to Rivers. I wanted to start drinking and consuming green power. We arrived at Rivers, and he already had 2 friends over whom I was not as close with. Must have been the day's theme. They do not feature prominently in this story, nor the rest of the written work, so they will not be named. Their presence made me feel a bit socially reserved, also in part because of the lessening DSL connection, but I maintained a positive attitude as I prepared green power consumption for us. River's two friends were green power novices, so naturally I felt like a sage as I effortlessly consumed the green power and quietly sat with the wisdom of my DSL experience. It was the end of another action-packed DSL day, and again I felt better for it. Still, this time I felt more humbled and was ready to take a break from the stuff. Though most would consider monthly DSL use to be too much, especially for a teenager, my 17-year-old self would have gave a tough argument for the opposite. I felt that each time I connected with DSL, it was as if I had created new neural pathways to greater understandings. Who knows how long it would have taken otherwise, if it was even possible to reach them without. Put simply, these were times where truly novel thoughts took place, and that was no small deal. How else would I have spent my post-SAT Saturday afternoon with my friends, I wonder? I probably still would have consumed green power, would have played soccer, and still would have gone to River's house later, but my focus would have been much less present. I would be closer to the mind of Thomas, and perhaps would have scoffed at Drew's incessant UFO dialogue, anxious for the next green power consumption. Instead, my day became a spectacle, an actual day to remember, as if personally touched by the great unknown's divinity. It was a day for intellectual, spiritual, and emotional development, and all thanks to the mysterious neurological workings of the DSL connection. It felt much more important than the prescribed marketed test of knowledge known as the SAT, which somehow scores one on an objective metric of intellect. So I ask, why should we jump to the conclusion that having one such great unknown experience every month of the year is necessarily detrimental to the psyche? Why shouldn't we even consider a seasonal consumption, such as 4 times a year? The answer is because those who have never connected, nor done the proper research, are not comfortable with the prospect of the great unknown. But I did choose to take a break from the DSL after this SAT day. I feel that one can sense the progress one makes with a solid DSL connection, and if one feels it so, I think it's best to integrate rather than immediately plan the next. For me, there are at least 1 or 2 days after a connection where it's easier to find myself in a daydream with my gaze steadily fixed in a certain direction. Though this habit caters excellently to trance meditative types, it is also a possible catatonic adverse side effect. My take is that, during a connection with the great unknown, consciousness gains access to a sensory realm one rarely has access to. The brain experiences less conventional filtering of perceptions, and thus more reality content is absorbed into the human psyche. So the spacey states I have found myself in a day or two after my connections could be viewed more as sessions of integration rather than harmful distractions. To be in reverie with the remnants of a shamanic ecstasy is like dwelling in the memories of concerts and the best of birthdays. The brain simply needs time to get back into consensus reality operating mode, or as some refer to it, the default mode network. Of course, we need more research into the long-term effects of monthly and seasonal use of DSL and mycosporin, but I have a feeling my example isn't exactly anomalous with respect to the greater population. Anyway, I felt in my mind that I ought to take a break from the DSL connection, but I didn't see mycosporin as in the same category necessarily. I felt I could dose myself with mycosporin responsibly enough so as to not go over the deep end simply by eating less of it. One can apply the same thinking to DSL just as well, but dosing DSL is much harder due to the microscopic nature of the doses. I cannot remember when I made a plan of it, or if I actually did. but I waited a week before my next mycospawn experience. These were abundant times,